In 1906, a newly married couple stood before a church in a small American town, their smiles bright with hope for the future. The photographer captured what should have been a perfect moment, until someone noticed something impossible in the developed print. The shadow on the ground behind them didn't match their forms. It belonged to someone or something else. What you're about to hear is the strange story of a photograph that should never have existed, and the mystery that has haunted one family for over a century. Before we begin, if you enjoy this kind of content, leave a like to support the channel. The morning of October 14th, 1906, arrived with crisp autumn air sweeping through the streets of Ashford, Massachusetts. Margaret Hayes stood before the mirror in her childhood bedroom, her fingers trembling as she fastened the pearl buttons on her ivory wedding dress. Outside, the maple trees blazed with orange and red leaves, and the scent of wood smoke drifted through the half-open window. "Are you nervous?" her younger sister Clara asked, adjusting the veil that had belonged to their mother. Margaret smiled, though her reflection showed the anxiety in her eyes. "Thomas is a good man. I'm not nervous about marrying him. It feels like everything is changing so fast." The Hayes family had lived in Ashford for 3 generations, running the general store on Main Street. Thomas Brennan, Margaret's husband-to-be, had arrived in town 2 years earlier, a carpenter from Boston, seeking quieter work and a simpler life. He'd walked into the store one rainy afternoon looking for nails and left with plans to return the next day, not for supplies, but to see the dark-haired young woman who'd sold them to him. Their courtship had been proper and measured, as was expected in those days. Sunday walks after church, chaperoned visits in the Hayes parlor, letters exchanged when Thomas traveled to nearby towns for carpentry work. He'd proposed on a warm June evening, presenting Margaret with a simple gold band he'd saved 3 months to afford. Now, 4 months later, the whole town had gathered at St. Michael's Episcopal Church for the ceremony. The wooden pews creaked under the weight of neighbors, shopkeepers, and distant relatives. Reverend Patterson, who had baptized Margaret as an infant, stood at the altar with his well-worn Bible, ready to unite the couple. Thomas waited at the front of the church, his hands clasped behind his back to hide their shaking. His best man, Robert Chen, a fellow carpenter and one of the few Chinese immigrants in Ashford, stood beside him, offering quiet encouragement. "She'll be beautiful," Robert whispered. "Stop looking so terrified." "I'm not terrified," Thomas replied, though his voice suggested otherwise. This is the most important day of my life." The church organ began to play, and every head turned toward the back of the sanctuary. Margaret appeared in the doorway on her father's arm, the afternoon light streaming through the stained glass windows and casting colored patterns across her dress. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. In that moment, all his nervousness melted away, replaced by certainty. The ceremony proceeded with traditional solemnity. Reverend Patterson's voice carried through the church as he spoke of duty, devotion, and the sacred bond of marriage. Margaret and Thomas exchanged their vows, their voices steady, despite the magnitude of the promises they were making. When Thomas slipped the ring onto Margaret's finger, she felt the cool metal against her skin and thought of all the years stretching ahead of them. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Patterson declared, closing his Bible with a soft thud. "You may kiss your bride." The kiss was brief and chaste, appropriate for the setting, but it sealed their union before God and the community. Applause rippled through the congregation as the newly married couple turned to face their guests, their faces glowing with joy and relief. Outside, the reception was set up in the churchyard, with tables laden with food prepared by the women of Ashford. There was roasted chicken, fresh bread, apple pie, and cider pressed from the autumn harvest. Children ran between the adults' legs, their laughter mixing with the conversations of their parents. A small group of musicians, a fiddler, a guitarist, and a man with a worn accordion, provided cheerful music. As the afternoon wore on and the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Margaret's father approached the couple with a suggestion. "Why don't we have a proper photograph taken? Just you two in front of the church. Something to remember this day. Photography was still relatively new and expensive in 1906, particularly in small towns. Most families had only a handful of photographs in their entire lives: births, weddings, funerals. Margaret's father had hired Samuel Pritchard, a traveling photographer, who'd set up a temporary studio in Ashford for the week, specifically for this occasion. Mr. Pritchard approached with his large format camera mounted on a wooden tripod, the brass lens gleaming in the late afternoon light. "I'll need you both to stand very still," he instructed, positioning the couple in front of the church's white-painted doors. "The exposure will take several seconds. Even the slightest movement can blur the image." Margaret and Thomas stood side by side, his arm around her waist, both facing the camera with expressions of happiness mixed with the formal seriousness that photographs of that era demanded. The church rose behind them, its simple wooden structure and modest steeple a testament to the humble faith of the community. If you're enjoying the video so far, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps. Mr. Pritchard disappeared beneath the black cloth covering the back of his camera, making final adjustments. "Hold perfectly still," he called out, his voice muffled. "1, 2, 3... The shutter clicked open, and time seemed to suspend itself. Margaret felt the weight of the moment, the awareness that this instant was being captured, preserved, made permanent. She held her breath, keeping as motionless as a statue, Thomas equally rigid beside her. After what felt like an eternity but was only 8 seconds, Mr. Pritchard emerged from beneath the cloth. "Perfect. You can relax now." The couple smiled at each other, and Margaret squeezed Thomas's hand. They had no way of knowing that the photograph just taken would become something far more than a wedding memento. They couldn't imagine that the image would be passed down through generations, studied, debated, and feared. They didn't see what the camera had seen, what the developing chemicals would soon reveal. As the reception continued into the evening, as toasts were made and dances were shared, as the newly married couple accepted congratulations and gifts from their community, the glass plate negative sat in Mr. Pritchard's equipment case, waiting to be developed. The image was already there, chemically imprinted, holding a secret that no one present could have anticipated. The shadow on the ground behind Margaret and Thomas, the shadow that would change everything, was already waiting to be discovered. 3 days after the wedding, Margaret and Thomas Brennan began their life together in a small rented house on Elm Street, 2 blocks from the Hayes family store. The house was modest: 2 bedrooms upstairs, a parlor and kitchen downstairs, and a small yard where Margaret hoped to plant vegetables come spring. Thomas had spent the previous month making repairs, fixing loose floorboards, replacing cracked window panes, and building new shelves in the kitchen. On the morning of October 17th, a knock at the door interrupted their breakfast. Margaret opened it to find Samuel Pritchard, the photographer, standing on their porch with a manila envelope in his hands. "Good morning, Mrs. Brennan," he said, tipping his hat. His face looked drawn, the skin around his eyes tight with something that might have been fatigue or perhaps concern. "I've brought your wedding photograph." "How wonderful," Margaret exclaimed, taking the envelope. "Would you like to come in? We're just having coffee." Mr. Pritchard hesitated, his gaze dropping to the envelope in Margaret's hands. No, thank you. I have several other deliveries to make this morning." He paused, seemed about to say something more, then simply nodded and turned to leave. Margaret closed the door, puzzled by the photographer's odd manner, but too excited about the photograph to dwell on it. She carried the envelope to the kitchen table where Thomas was finishing his eggs. "It's here," she said, carefully opening the envelope. "Our wedding picture." She pulled out the photograph, printed on thick paper stock with a subtle sepia tone. There they were, standing before St. Michael's Church, captured forever in that golden October afternoon light. Margaret's dress looked beautiful in the photograph, the details of the lace visible even in the print. Thomas stood tall beside her, his arm around her waist, both of them wearing expressions of solemn joy. "It's a fine picture," Thomas said, reaching for it. "We should have it framed." Margaret nodded, smiling as she studied the image. Her eyes drifted across the composition, the church doors behind them, the steps leading up to the entrance, the ground at their feet where their shadows should have. She stopped. Her smile faded. "Thomas," she said quietly, "look at this." She pointed to the ground in the photograph, to the shadows cast by the afternoon sun. Their shadows should have been clear, two elongated forms stretching across the church steps. But what the photograph showed was impossible. There were three shadows. Two of them roughly corresponded to Margaret and Thomas's positions, though even these seemed slightly distorted, the angles not quite right. But the third shadow was different. It stood between them and slightly behind, its form suggesting a human figure but taller, more angular than either of them. The head of this shadow figure appeared to have something protruding from it. Not hair exactly, but something else. Something that looked almost like horns, or perhaps a strange hat, or... "That's just a trick of the light," Thomas said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe a tree branch casting a shadow, or someone walking past during the exposure." "There are no trees near the church entrance," Margaret replied, her finger tracing the outline of the impossible shadow. "And Mr. Pritchard said we had to stand perfectly still. If someone had walked past, he would have noticed. He would have retaken the photograph." They sat in silence, staring at the image. The shadow figure seemed to have substance and presence, despite being nothing more than an absence of light on paper. Its form suggested intentionality, as if it had positioned itself deliberately between the newlyweds, claiming a place in their wedding portrait. "Leave a comment below about what you think of this story so far." Thomas finally spoke. "Maybe we shouldn't mention this to anyone. People might think, I don't know what they'd think, but it would invite gossip, and we're just starting our life together. We don't need that kind of attention." Margaret wanted to agree, wanted to dismiss the strange shadow as an optical anomaly, a developing error, anything rational and explainable, but something in the pit of her stomach, an instinct she couldn't name, told her this was different. This was wrong. "I want to talk to Mr. Pritchard," she said. "I want to ask him if he noticed anything unusual when he took the photograph." They found Samuel Pritchard at the boarding house where he was staying during his week in Ashford. The landlady directed them to his room on the second floor. When Mr. Pritchard opened the door, his expression immediately changed from surprise to something like resignation. "You've seen it then," he said without preamble. "The shadow." "So you did notice," Margaret said. "When you developed the photograph, you saw it." Mr. Pritchard stepped back, allowing them to enter his small room. Photographic equipment was scattered across every surface. Cameras, glass plates, bottles of developing chemicals, drying prints hanging from a makeshift line. The sharp smell of silver nitrate and acetic acid filled the air. "I've been a photographer for 15 years, Mr. Pritchard said, sitting heavily on the edge of his narrow bed. "I've taken thousands of photographs, portraits, landscapes, buildings, everything you can imagine. I've seen developing errors, double exposures, light leaks, chemical stains. I know every possible flaw and mistake that can occur in this process." He paused, his hands clasped together, knuckles white with tension. "That shadow in your photograph is none of those things. I developed the plate 3 separate times, thinking I'd made an error. Each time, the shadow appeared exactly the same. I even examined the glass negative under magnification. The shadow is there, sharp and clear, as real as your own images." "But what is it?" Thomas asked. "Where did it come from?" Mr. Pritchard shook his head. "I don't know, but I'll tell you this. I've felt uneasy since taking that photograph. When I was setting up the shot, just before I triggered the shutter, I felt cold. A sudden chill running down my spine, even though it was a warm afternoon. And I thought I saw something from the corner of my eye, a movement, a shape. But when I looked directly, there was nothing there. Just you two standing before the church." Margaret felt her skin prickle. "Did you see anything else unusual in the churchyard or during the reception?" "No," Mr. Pritchard said, "but after I developed your photograph, I couldn't stop thinking about it. So I did something perhaps I shouldn't have. I went to the church late last night when it was empty, and I took another photograph of the front entrance using the same camera, the same position, the same time of exposure." He stood and walked to his makeshift drying line, pulling down a print that had been hanging there. He handed it to Margaret. The photograph showed the church entrance in daylight, empty, peaceful. The steps were bare, the white doors were closed, and on the ground, where there should have been nothing but earth and grass, there was a shadow. The same shadow, the same tall, angular form, with that strange protrusion from its head, standing there alone, as if waiting. "I'm leaving Ashford today," Mr. Pritchard said quietly. "I've packed my equipment and cancelled my remaining appointments. I suggest you destroy both photographs and never speak of this to anyone. Some things are better left alone." Margaret and Thomas walked home in silence, the two photographs tucked in Margaret's bag. Neither of them spoke of what they would do with the images, whether they would follow Mr. Pritchard's advice and destroy them. But that night, Thomas placed both photographs in a wooden box and stored it in the attic, unable to burn them but equally unable to display them. The shadow had become part of their marriage, an uninvited witness to their union, and no matter what they did, they couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, watching, waiting, present in ways they couldn't see but could somehow feel. Winter came early to Ashford that year. By mid-November, snow blanketed the streets and ice formed on the windows of the Brennan house. Margaret found herself increasingly drawn to the attic, to the wooden box containing the photographs. She would climb the narrow stairs when Thomas was at work, open the box and study the shadow figure, trying to understand what it was, what it wanted, why it had appeared on their wedding day. Thomas noticed the change in his wife. She grew quiet, distant, often staring at nothing as if seeing something invisible to his eyes. Dark circles appeared under her eyes from nights of poor sleep. When he asked what troubled her, she would simply shake her head and say she was adjusting to married life, to running a household, to the expectations of being a wife. But it wasn't adjustment that kept her awake. It was the feeling that someone else was in the house with them. An unseen presence that moved through rooms, displaced objects, created cold spots that had nothing to do with drafts or poor insulation. On December 3rd, Margaret was preparing dinner when she heard footsteps on the stairs. Heavy, deliberate footsteps climbing from the first floor to the second. She froze, knife in hand, listening. Thomas wasn't due home for another hour. No one else had a key to the house. "Hello?" she called out, her voice shaking. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped. Silence filled the house, thick and oppressive. Margaret set down the knife and walked to the base of the stairs, looking up into the darkened second floor. Nothing moved, no shadows shifted, but the air felt different, charged with a presence she couldn't name. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking under her weight. The upstairs hallway was empty. The doors to both bedrooms stood open, revealing nothing unusual. But when she looked at the ceiling, at the entrance to the attic, she saw the trap door was slightly ajar. She was certain she'd closed it firmly after her last visit. Margaret pulled down the attic ladder and climbed up, her heart pounding. Weak winter light filtered through the small attic window, illuminating the stored boxes, old furniture, and dusty odds and ends that accumulate in any home. The wooden box containing the photographs sat where Thomas had placed it, but its lid was open. The photographs were gone. Margaret searched frantically, tearing through boxes, lifting old blankets, checking every corner of the attic. The photographs had vanished, but in their place, lying on the floor where the wooden box had sat, was something else. A piece of thick paper, yellowed with age, covered in handwriting she didn't recognize. The text was dated 1823 and appeared to be an excerpt from a journal or diary. Today we laid the cornerstone for St. Michael's Church. Reverend Blackwood blessed the site and led us in prayer, but I cannot shake the memory of what stood here before, the old meeting house where they say the trials occurred. They say innocent people died here, accused of witchcraft by neighbors driven mad with fear. The land itself remembers. I pray our new church will bring peace to this place, but I fear some sins run too deep to be washed away with prayer alone. I saw something today as we worked. A shadow that shouldn't have been there, tall and wrong, watching us from where no person stood. The others didn't see it, or perhaps they chose not to, but I saw it, and I know it saw me too. If you're enjoying this story, leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss future videos. Margaret's hands trembled as she read the words. The church where she and Thomas had been married, the church that had been the center of Ashford's spiritual life for over 80 years, had been built on the site of something darker. The shadow in their photograph wasn't a random occurrence or a trick of light. It was something tied to the land itself, to events that had occurred long before any living person in Ashford had been born. She heard the front door open downstairs. Thomas was home early. Margaret quickly folded the old paper and slipped it into her apron pocket, then climbed down from the attic. She found Thomas in the kitchen, shrugging off his coat, his face red from the cold. "You won't believe what happened today," he said, hanging his coat on the hook by the door. "Robert Chen came to the workshop this morning looking strange, pale, shaking. He told me he'd had the most vivid nightmare last night. He was standing in front of St. Michael's Church, and there was a figure there, tall and dark, with something like horns or a strange hat. It was watching him, and he felt this overwhelming dread, like the thing was going to reach out and—" Thomas stopped mid-sentence, seeing the expression on Margaret's face. "Margaret? What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." She pulled the old paper from her pocket and handed it to him. As he read, his face went pale. "We need to find out what happened here," Margaret said. "In 1823, when the church was built. Before that, when this was a meeting house. We need to understand what we're dealing with." Over the following weeks, they conducted quiet research, careful not to draw attention to their investigation. Margaret spent hours at the Ashford Historical Society, reading through old records, town documents, and personal journals. Thomas spoke with elderly residents, asking casual questions about the town's history, about St. Michael's Church, about stories their grandparents might have told them. What they discovered painted a dark picture. In the winter of 1692-1693, during the height of the witch trial hysteria that had swept through Massachusetts, Ashford had conducted its own trials. 7 people had been accused of witchcraft, 6 women and 1 man. Unlike the more famous trials in Salem, the Ashford trials had been conducted in relative secrecy, driven by a small group of influential townspeople who used the accusations to settle personal vendettas and seize property. 4 of the accused had been hanged. 2 had died in prison from harsh conditions and illness. 1, a man named Josiah Brennan, had escaped custody and fled into the wilderness, never to be seen again. When Thomas read that name, he felt his stomach drop. Brennan. His family name, a name he'd never thought much about, assuming it was common enough in Irish communities that the coincidence meant nothing. But now he wondered. He traced his family lineage back as far as he could through birth records and church documents. His grandfather had come to Boston from Ireland in the 1820s, or so the family story went. But what if that story was incomplete? What if the Brennan line had deeper roots in New England? Margaret found a detailed account of Josiah Brennan's trial in a private journal kept by one of the town magistrates. Josiah had been a farmer, a quiet man who kept to himself and was known for his skill in predicting weather patterns and crop yields. His wife had died young, and he'd raised their daughter alone. When accusations began to fly, someone, the journal didn't specify who, had claimed Josiah possessed unnatural knowledge, that he'd made a bargain with dark forces, that his shadow had been seen moving independently from his body. The trial had been brief. Josiah had maintained his innocence, but the hysteria of the times made rationality impossible. On the night before his scheduled execution, he'd somehow freed himself from the meeting house where prisoners were kept and vanished. Some said he'd used witchcraft to escape. Others believed sympathetic townspeople had helped him. The journal contained one final chilling entry about Josiah Brennan. The prisoner has escaped, but I fear he did not go far. Last night, as I walked past the meeting house, I saw a shadow on the wall that moved without source. It was tall and wrong, and it watched me as I passed. I believe Josiah Brennan did not flee into the wilderness as we thought. I believe something of him remained here, bound to this place where he was falsely accused, where innocents were murdered in the name of God. I believe we have created something that will outlast all of us, a presence that will linger long after our bones turn to dust. Thomas set down the journal copy, his hands shaking. If Josiah Brennan was my ancestor, he said slowly, if his blood runs in my veins, then maybe the shadow in our photograph isn't random. Maybe it was drawn to me, to us. Margaret reached across the table and took his hand. What do we do? How do we make this stop? I don't know if we can, Thomas admitted. That paper from the attic said the land remembers. If that's true, if something of Josiah or the others who died unjustly is still here, still bound to that place, then maybe it's not about making it stop. Maybe it's about understanding why it appeared to us, what it wants, what message it's trying to convey. They sat together in the quiet of their kitchen, snow falling outside the windows, wondering what price they would pay for building their life together in a town where the past refused to stay buried. As winter deepened and 1906 turned to 1907, Margaret and Thomas Brennan learned to live with their unusual situation. The wedding photographs never reappeared, though they occasionally found them in unexpected places, tucked inside a book neither of them had touched, propped against the mirror in their bedroom, once even folded carefully and placed inside the Bible Margaret's mother had given them. Each time they would return the photographs to the attic box, knowing they would likely move again. The presence in their house, the shadow figure from the photograph, became an acknowledged but unspoken part of their daily lives. They felt it most strongly in the evening hours, particularly around dusk, when natural shadows grew long and the line between seen and unseen became thin. Sometimes Margaret would catch a glimpse of something tall and dark from the corner of her eye, standing in a doorway or at the top of the stairs. Sometimes Thomas would feel someone standing behind him as he worked at his carpentry bench, a presence that disappeared the moment he turned around. They told no one. What would they say? That they believed the shadow of a man executed in a witch trial over 200 years ago had chosen to appear in their wedding photograph. That they felt his presence in their home, neither threatening nor comforting, simply there. People would think them mad. The town was already suspicious of strange claims, and the history of the witch trials, though distant, had left a legacy of distrust toward anything that couldn't be rationally explained. In February, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. The news brought joy mixed with apprehension. What world were they bringing a child into? Would the shadow presence affect their baby? Would their child grow up sensing things others couldn't, seeing what shouldn't be visible? Thomas's concern manifested differently. He became protective, almost obsessive about the house. He reinforced every door, checked every window, lit extra lamps at night as if light could somehow keep the shadows at bay. He knew it was irrational. The presence had never harmed them, had never even seemed actively malevolent. But the instinct to protect his family overrode logic. One evening in March, as spring began to thaw the frozen ground, Margaret sat in the parlour sewing baby clothes, while Thomas read by lamplight. The fire in the hearth crackled softly. Outside, the last of the winter wind rattled the windows. "Thomas," Margaret said quietly, setting down her sewing, "I've been thinking about Josiah Brennan. About what happened to him, to all of them. They were innocent people accused by neighbors they trusted, condemned by a community driven mad with fear. They died without justice, without anyone acknowledging the wrong done to them. Thomas looked up from his book. Where are you going with this? I think the shadow appears because the story isn't finished, Margaret continued. Because no one ever admitted the trials were wrong, that innocent people were murdered. The church was built right on top of that history, literally covering it up instead of acknowledging it. Maybe the shadow isn't trying to frighten us. Maybe it's trying to be remembered. What can we do about it? Thomas asked. The people responsible died centuries ago. We can't change what happened. No, Margaret agreed, but we can acknowledge it. We can remember them. We can make sure their names aren't forgotten. Over the following weeks, Margaret worked on a project. She researched each of the 7 people accused in Ashford's witch trials, their names, their families, their lives, before the accusations destroyed them. She wrote their stories in a journal, carefully documenting everything she could find. Josiah Brennan, the farmer with an innocent daughter, Sarah Whitmore, an elderly widow accused after inheriting her husband's property, Elizabeth Cross, a midwife whose skills at helping women through childbirth were reinterpreted as witchcraft, Mary and Rebecca Hayes, sisters accused together and executed together, Jonathan Miller, a blacksmith who'd argued with the wrong person, and Catherine Lane, a young woman whose beauty had sparked jealousy. 7 names, 7 lives cut short by fear and superstition, 7 shadows that perhaps still lingered, waiting for someone to remember them not as witches, but as victims. On a warm April afternoon, Margaret and Thomas walked to St. Michael's Church. They'd arranged to speak with Reverend Patterson, the same minister who'd married them 6 months earlier. In the Reverend's small office, surrounded by religious texts and the smell of old paper, they told him about the photograph, about their research, about the dark history that had preceded the church's construction. Reverend Patterson listened without interruption, his weathered face showing neither disbelief nor judgment. When they finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "I've been minister here for 34 years, he finally said. And in all that time I felt something in the church, particularly in the evening when I'm here alone. A presence, not malevolent but sad, deeply, profoundly sad. I've prayed about it, but prayer seemed insufficient. Now I understand why." He stood and walked to his window, looking out at the churchyard where spring flowers were beginning to bloom. "What you're suggesting," he continued, "acknowledging what happened here, honoring those who were wrongly killed, it would be controversial. There are people in this town whose ancestors served as magistrates in those trials. They won't welcome attention to that history. We're not asking them to feel guilt for what their ancestors did," Margaret said. "We're just asking that the victims be remembered, that their names be spoken, that what happened to them isn't buried and forgotten." Reverend Patterson turned back to them, his expression resolved. "Then we'll do it. Next month on the first Sunday of May, I'll conduct a memorial service. We'll acknowledge what happened, we'll speak the names of the accused, and we'll pray, not just for their souls, but for our own, for a community that lost its way to fear." The service took place on a bright May morning. Reverend Patterson had spread word quietly, explaining only that it would honor victims of past injustices. Many in the congregation came with little understanding of what would be discussed, but they came out of respect for their minister and curiosity about the unusual announcement. From the pulpit, Reverend Patterson spoke with quiet power about fear, about how good people can do terrible things when they allow suspicion to override compassion. He told the stories Margaret had uncovered, 7 lives, 7 tragedies. He spoke each name clearly: Josiah Brennan, Sarah Whitmore, Elizabeth Cross, Mary Hayes, Rebecca Hayes, Jonathan Miller, Catherine Lane. Some in the congregation shifted uncomfortably, others wept. A few left in protest, but most stayed, bearing witness to history that had been buried for too long. After the service, Margaret and Thomas stood in the churchyard where they'd taken their wedding photograph. The spring sun was warm on their faces. Thomas held Margaret's hand, feeling the slight swell of her belly where their child grew. "Do you feel it?" Margaret asked quietly. Thomas nodded. The oppressive sense of presence that had followed them since their wedding day had lifted. The air felt lighter, cleaner. The shadows around them were just shadows, natural effects of sunlight blocked by solid objects, nothing more. That night, when they returned home, Thomas climbed into the attic and opened the wooden box. The photographs were there, exactly where they'd been placed, but something had changed. The shadow figure was still visible in the prints that hadn't magically vanished. But when Thomas looked at it now, it seemed less ominous, less threatening. Just a shadow caught in silver and paper, a reminder of history rather than a haunting. He brought the photographs downstairs and showed them to Margaret. "Should we frame them?" he asked. Margaret studied the images, seeing herself and Thomas as they'd been on their wedding day, young, hopeful, beginning their life together. And between them, the shadow that wasn't theirs, the presence that had forced them to confront difficult history, that had connected them to stories that needed to be told. "Yes," she said, "frame them both. We'll hang them in the hallway where we'll see them every day, not to frighten us, but to remember. To remember the past, to remember the innocent who suffered, and to remember that even in our happiest moments, we're connected to history in ways we don't always understand." The wedding photographs of Margaret and Thomas Brennan remained in their family for generations. Each descendant who inherited them learned the story, not just of the shadow in the prints, but of the memorial service that had finally acknowledged Ashford's dark past. The photographs became a family heirloom, passed down alongside the journal Margaret had kept documenting the lives of the 7 victims. In 1952, the Ashford Historical Society officially recognized the witch trial victims, installing a small memorial plaque near St. Michael's Church. In 2003, their descendants received formal pardons from the state of Massachusetts, along with the many others wrongly convicted during that era of hysteria. The shadow in the 1906 photograph was never explained by any scientific analysis. Photographic experts who examined the prints in later years could find no evidence of double exposure, chemical defects, or any known developing error. It remained what it had always been, an anomaly, a mystery, a presence captured in silver and light. Margaret and Thomas Brennan lived long lives together. They raised 4 children in the house on Elm Street, and none of them ever reported seeing or feeling the presence that had troubled their parents in those early months of marriage. The shadow, it seemed, had found what it needed. Not explanation, not rationalization, but simple acknowledgement. Someone had finally remembered. The photograph still exists today, kept in climate-controlled storage at the Ashford Historical Society. Occasionally, a researcher or curious visitor will ask to see it, will study the tall shadow standing between the newlyweds, and will wonder what they're really seeing. Is it a trick of light, a developing error, something that science hasn't yet explained? Or is it exactly what Margaret Brennan believed it to be, a reminder that history leaves marks on the world in ways we can't always see, that the past and present exist in closer proximity than we imagine, and that sometimes the shadows we fear are simply asking us to remember? If you enjoyed this video, leave a comment below. I love hearing your thoughts and answering questions. If you're not subscribed, yet make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss future videos.